And we are very, very fortunate to have Ceri here, who was editor of the film, and who will surely be able to answer quite a lot of questions. So can I see anybody who would like to ask a question here? Ah, that's great. Yeah. I think we're just going to, it's such, you know, we're just, maybe you can go.
Yeah, whatever you, however you want to do it.
Yeah.
For me, I grew up in Albania, so I was 17 when the communist regime fell. And this is the first kind of balanced, honestly, I'm 43 now, balanced documentary I see in terms of, because after that everything was evil, everything was bad about it. But while I was watching it, what I noticed, what I missed quite a lot, in Albania, what the socialism did, it brought really, Albania was the poorest country in Europe before, in the capitalist system. Means you had a minority who were super wealthy and the rest was super poor. They had three religions, you know, Catholic, Orthodox and Muslims, and they're all kind of enemies. And the analphabetism was like 95, 96%, you know. And the socialist system brought it down to 100%, like they got rid of analphabetism, they got rid of, they made the women equals, they built roads, they electrified the whole country. So in terms of the technology, I missed that the whatever Red Revolution embraced technology, you know, and it brought, actually, it's the only way to be able to take those tools and bring a society out of poverty. I work constantly in Africa, I'm an architect, you know, and I see that the communist, the capitalist system they have will never bring those countries out of poverty. You know, that's the thing which became very clear to me, and nobody talks about it. Yeah, I personally, yeah, I just miss it. And, I don't know if you understand what I mean. Or
Definitely, yes.
because the capitalism says it brings forth technology, and that's bullshit. It does to a certain extent. We see it now, and after that, it controls, it stops innovation. That's what's happening now. Once they reach a peak, it stops innovation, where the communist movement makes it public, you know, takes it and makes it into a mass product. So that's a huge thing, that's a positive thing, and that's where I feel where we are now, that innovation has stopped, people don't see it. That free competition is not there, you know. And yeah, I wish I'd see that approach and say, look how good it is for innovation technology to even bring Africa out of poverty, which I've been asking myself all the time, what's the best way?
Okay.
Sorry
That's
for
no, that's great, yeah. Yeah, Stefan.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ceri, for this. I think really brilliant documentation, and I just actually want to add or to support what you said, that this is really a balance, but also I think it gives us a kind of new perspective also on the Russian Revolution that might have been lost nowadays. So I think it from that perspective it was really a good documentation. I really appreciate that. I've actually one question is, can you tell us a little bit about the reaction that you got from the screening of the movies, how it was perceived in Britain? So I would be really interested in that. And furthermore, when you did this movie, is that you went to St. Petersburg, and then you were, I mean, how you were doing that? So you have this, I think, if I were right, you have these old films, and then you have that, how St. Petersburg still, actually, it's interesting, it still looks as if it were 1917, right? So from, at least from the movie, so which is interesting. But maybe you can tell us a little bit how you decided to do that in that way, and yeah, that's it.
Okay.
Shall I deal with these?
Yeah, I've got one question too, Ceri, which I can maybe throw in.
Throw it in.
And that is, it's maybe linked to the technology question, because It's kind of funny that, you know, you sort of described the enthusiasm, you say that it was a revolution, a liberating thing, a fight for freedom, which I was very much interested in. But then you've got the other side, which is the fall of the Berlin Wall, which happened 27 years ago, and in fact this, what we're sitting now, was actually in the former East, which was equally enthusing, and people were saying this is a liberational thing. So thank God all this is over, thank God all of that is history, and you know, the West has actually won, you know, quite contrary to what you were saying. You know, the West was actually the only force which was able to, and capitalism, which was able to move people forward. Because look at what happened in the East, you know, it could not compete with the West. So how would you sort of counter that, you know? So maybe a bit of a German perspective. Anyway, yeah.
Okay, very exciting questions. They're very testing. I really love your point about technology. And actually, prior, 10 years ago, I shot 5 films in Ghana. It's a series called Pricking the Missionary Position, actually looking at development and all sorts of things as opposed to the sort of post-colonial mentality, treating the developing world like children and incapable of scientific and technological advance. And we found some really interesting stuff. So, for example, because a country like Ghana was really much a part of in the Cold War period, a kind of bargaining tool between the Soviet Union and Britain and America, a whole nuclear reactor was shipped out to Ghana that wanted to develop nuclear energy and was stopped on the high seas. And the whole area in Accra had been developed in order to be home for this reactor because they're so desperate just for decent energy, because all sorts of you know, hydroelectric power and stuff has failed. So basic for industry and for development. And so they developed this whole area, and it was called, there's the nuclear road, there's the nuclear bar, there's a nuclear restaurant. I mean, just incredible, huge housing estate type areas, all just like ghost towns. And to me that was quite interesting, but for me development and technology in relation to that has always been very, very important. We didn't explore it in the film. And I think it's one of many things we didn't actually push in the film. And I think pursuing it vis-a-vis something like the Albania story would be very, very interesting. I mean, all we've managed to sort of fit into the film, if you like, is to touch on that idea of it being an inspiration, a breakthrough. And then I then think, which relates to your point, I think we have to be quite honest about, despite the good things that do come from that and the inspiration it provides, and even the extent to which capitalist elites are forced to provide certain, you know, ameliorating, you know, stuff, from the franchise for women in Britain, for example, for some women in Britain in 1918 and so on and so forth, or state intervention in the economy. Stalinism does hold up scientific advance too. That the failure doesn't live up to its promise. And that's absolutely tragic. So yes, huge leaps forward, but also entirely capped in terms of human possibility and innovation. So, and we kind of felt, how far do you go with this story? The film we finished the year before on the life of C.L.R. James, that some of you may or may not have heard of, which turned into this sort of which ended up being a 6-year project and a 2.25-hour epic to watch. We couldn't do that with this film. You know, we kind of started it in February last year and we finished it just in time for October. And that was making it with 20 volunteers learning camera as they went along. And me beating them, as I was explaining to Sabina, that sort of beating them to read whole books, you know, when what they hoped was that you could get it all off a Wikipedia, you know, entry. And I'm going, oh no, it's not going to do. And we were literally rushing, and you literally had to go, when you get to the edit, you just have to go slash, 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 slash. You know, we'd be given the opportunity to launch it at a big art centre at the Battle of Ideas at Barbican in London in October. as long as it wasn't more than an hour and a quarter, and we stretched it to 1 hour and 16 minutes, you know, just to get that extra minute in. And so a whole lot of things were lost. But I think there's another film to be made just on the science side. And what's interesting, one of the guys we interviewed in the film, Phil Cunliffe, who's an international relations lecturer, he's just brought a book out called Lenin Lives. Sounds weird, it is a bit weird. But it's a counterfactual history. And he starts his book off with the scientific possibilities that have been destroyed because of the failure of the revolution. And because capitalism wins, it's taken science with it. And it's a really weird story. So he starts off with now, what he sees as the cap on science, and then does this counterfactual history where the German Revolution succeeds. There's revolutionary upheaval in America. It's a very weird thing to read. Really meticulously researched. So he's always relating to what did happen, but then what could, if it had been, things had slightly changed. To arrive at this entirely different scenario today, where we certainly wouldn't be discussing the Russian Revolution, because that would have been just a blip compared with human achievement. Fantastic little thing to read. I mean, it's slightly weird doing a counterfactual, what if? But actually very trendy, you know, they've done the sort of, what if the Nazis had won in America? You'll have seen High Castle and, you know, all those kind of trendy things. Anyway, I digress. It's another film to be made, but I loved your point. Very quickly, that we wanted to do the, originally, all our volunteers and that are learning to shoot with us, that I'm really horrid to, and beating them up, making them read whole books. We all wanted to go to St. Petersburg, obviously. You know, what a brilliant idea. The more work, we were going to go last April, because we realised, if you know anything about filming, you'll know that filming in low temperatures is a disaster. You know, your batteries last 5 minutes. Really, it's really problematic, just as filming in tropical heat is very difficult. So we thought we'll go in April, when it's, you know, slightly warmed up, and got very, very excited. And then all the pricing we did, and it was really ridiculous. It was going to cost us about £1,000 each because of the amount of film permissions and passes, and not just a normal visa that you have to pay for on top of airfares and everything else before you start. And you just thought, for what? You know, that's 20 grand, £1,000 each, to get what? You know, a fantastic holiday, if we're honest. Yeah, we could have all gone to the Hermitage, we could have all seen the Aurora, we could have all explored the Bible, we could all have seen the Finlandia station and the train, because the train's still there, that Lenin arrives in April 1917. Would have been very exciting, and we could have seen original archive and interviewed young Russians, but we did it in the end with one kid who spoke Russian, who's helped make the film, who was Russian, going out there and filming bits, because we wanted it to have a then and now, to kind of see, you know, to bring, I suppose, in maybe a cheesy way, to say the revolution matters today because it's such an important historical event that has shaped so much of the 20th century. Not to try and say, you know, people today ought to, you know, let me hit you around the head if you don't. Remember the Russian Revolution, because kids in Russia probably no different to kids in Germany, or maybe kids in Germany are much more political, I don't know, or in Britain. It doesn't mean much at all. Kids in Russia don't know much about the Russian Revolution, to be honest. It's a turn-off. And that would have been an interesting, different angle to look at in the film. Why do young people find it, you know, pretty disinteresting? And, I mean, so we wanted to do that then and now, just to give a sense of now. Here's St. Petersburg, but not really to draw more conclusions than that. And Leb and his mates, who are Russian, didn't want to be in the film, to be honest. They just camera shy, as a lot of kids we meet are, horribly camera shy. Oh, we just want to be behind the camera. that's fine. I hope I've you know, the fall of the East. I understand when people say to me, somebody was just talking to me earlier today, oh look, you know, it wasn't all bad. You know, I've got a house in Bulgaria. I can't afford one in London, and so I go to Bulgaria every summer, and they're always saying to me, oh well, it wasn't all bad. You know, even though it was this great imposition in Bulgaria, we did have, you know, we did have electrification, we did have homes to live in, and, you know, we did have jobs. And you go to somewhere like Bulgaria now, I don't know, you can tell me all about how much has changed in the East here. Whereas now people have returned to semi-subsistence life, you know, they're growing their own food, hardly anyone's got a job, and there's only, you know, 8.5 million people, and that's probably an exaggeration, left in Bulgaria. Everyone's left. Which is why people like me can get a house for a few grand, you know, because they're just empty. So I understand why people say that, but I don't think we should lower our horizons and say that somehow that was acceptable, because if you look back at the time, even the writings of people like Trotsky, or actually C.L.R. James himself, who we made the film about, they did a huge work of looking at the impact of those ideas of socialism in one country right round the world, and how far it held people back in those countries. In China, in relation to the Kuomintang, in the colonies, you know, in Britain, all over the place, that idea that we should line up with our own establishment, because it's more important to do that to save Russia than anything else, was an absolute disaster. And in the film, Norman Lewis's point, you know, the South African Communist Party, you know, workers of the world unite for a white South Africa. Those were the politics of socialism in one country. And people died in their thousands and were brought into the Second World War by the Communist Party. So I'm sympathetic to people's material circumstances, obviously changing, but I think we always have to remember how much more they could have changed if it hadn't been for the shit politics that resulted from the failure of the revolution. Oh, sorry, that was so long-winded.
Okay. So, yes, all right, okay. Yeah.
I really like the focus on democracy in your documentary. And it's interesting how it goes from this experiment in direct democracy into one of the most totalitarian states that ever existed. And I was wondering if there was something, how much this is down to the situation in Russia specifically. So if it had been working class British or German people who might have had more experience with democracy and more experience with organizing themselves politically, in trade unions, in producing magazines, in being in political parties, would something like Stalinism have ever been acceptable in that sort of context?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for that wonderful movie. I really enjoyed watching it. My question is on how was the reaction of the left in Great Britain on that movie? Because for me, when I look at Germany, I would say there was nearly no discussion about public debate on that issue. Okay, we have a quite interesting exhibition in the German Historic Museum on the Russian Revolution right now, but you really had a big discussion, and there was, especially from the left, I could hear nearly no celebration of the Russian Revolution as that significant event of the 20th century, and I wonder, perhaps when I look at the German left, it's because it was such a ambitioned event. There was so much dedication, so much optimism about the future, and also so much trust in the ability of ordinary people to change society. And when you look at the left today, for me it seems it nearly represents the opposite of what the revolutionary like Lenin and Trotsky stand for, because they are very pessimistic about the future. They have this state fetish. They see the state as the only agent for social change, and they have this big mistrust in the people. I would say, if you maybe, okay, also it's not only the left, but also it's within the left, this big mistrust in people's sovereignty, for example. You see, you have this discussion, especially when you look at the rise of populism here in Europe. It's very much this kind of, oh, look at these ordinary people. They are all potentially right-wing, racist, or bigots, and we have to control them somehow. And this for me seems like totally opposite of what could be the legacy of the Russian Revolution.
Yep. You want, yeah.
On your point about democracy, would it have been different if it happened elsewhere in terms of the totalitarianism of Stalin? Yes and no, because I don't think the issue is got anything to do with, you know, the level of trade unionism or organisation or experience of politics. Actually, I think if you look at the British example, where, you know, the Labour Party comes out of the trade unions, in fact, that becomes the dead hand. You know, it's known as the dead hand of Labour. And in fact, you had political social democratic or Labour Party organisations set up, as in the British example, who were explicit to stop any repeat of the lurid doings in Petrograd. You know, they're very, very clear that those political organisations were more democratic because they were terrified of things going even further, of revolution. And to me, I mean, I'm a true believer in indirect democracy, and which I think you're absolutely right, is the kind of, people look at in horror today, the idea that you, especially in Britain, as you all know, if you support the will of the people behind Brexit, you're an evil monster, you must be racist. Not actually, it's consistent with the true internationalism and belief in people. That idea of direct democracy now obviously is, and the contempt for people instead, is very, very powerful. So that idea of democracy, which for me in the film, the most powerful image we found, unfortunately because we had absolutely no money to make this film, you'll notice there's little bits of repeated archive, but we had to use everything we could source from, which was public domain. I think we spent about £1,000 on archive, whereas in the last film we made, I think we spent about £18,000 on archive, because archive is stupid money, it's really expensive. It's usually several £1,000s for a minute of footage. So we had to use stuff we could get for free, or that we could argue was what they call fair use, and is somehow explanatory within the film. Anyway, never mind that, but there is this wonderful shot of the Soviet that's absolutely packed out. So I don't know if you recall it. And we found it in the Russian archives, and it's stunning. A lot of other stuff we actually got from the American Library of Congress, because they've got more free stuff than anyone else. But that was from the Russian archives, and it's just such a powerful idea that anyone and everyone's in there, compared with, you know, in Britain you've got, I mean, I don't know what it looks like here in Germany, but in Britain it's people with these stupid wigs and protocols in the Houses of Parliament, and so on and so on. Or you look at the Duma in you know, that in Russia in Petrograd at the time, or in Moscow, and by contrast, you know, these sort of, instead of these sort of bewigged, or, you know, these lawyers and barristers and capitalists, everyone's in the Soviets. Really fantastic idea. And experience and education and all of that has got nothing to do with it. You know, it's a bit like the idea that you shouldn't be able to vote unless you've got a PhD, you know, unless you're highly educated, because it's the experience of life that counts in politics, along with the political ideas. And what we can't imagine, and I'm hoping some of that is conveyed in the film, is how political life was. You know, incredibly incredibly political. And that's why it's so wrong to see it as a conspiracy in October. By October, the majority have been won over. But even, you know, the reason that Lenin is in exile and Trotsky is in exile is because you already have a very political situation, you know, even though they're a minority at the time. The Mensheviks and social revolutionaries have got more of a majority. But there is huge, you know, I think there's something like 148 different left-wing papers, you know. We can't imagine anything like that level of people talking politics on the streets. There's a wonderful piece of Pathé News, newsreel from the time, which we couldn't use without paying for it, where it's just saying, and it goes on about, people were meeting on the streets and talking to one another. Nobody knows why. It was random, as if they're just like people who like chatting a lot in bad weather. Do you know what I mean? No appreciation of how political life was. And I think politics isn't about, you know, how much experience of organisation do you have, but your life experience in relation to prevailing ideas. And, you know, that just can't be sort of replicated. The difference obviously would have been had things come to fruition in Germany and Britain and America and elsewhere, which would have meant that A, you didn't have the armies of intervention and the starvation, and the number of people who were literally wiped out. But you would have had a much greater basis for international solidarity and not an isolated Russia. I'm sure. Oh, the reaction to the film. Well, it's quite funny, really. I mean, we only finished this in October. We've only had a few screenings. They've been packed out, which was great. They've been lovely audiences like you guys, not asking me really horrid things so far, she says. But online, oh my God, the emails I've had and the vitriol, it's amazing. You're a mass murderer, you know, you evil communist, you know, and Lenin killed more people than the Holocaust, and, you know, it's just extraordinary. I mean, and I know because I've got I did a PhD in Russian history, and you kind of think, what is that? The Russian history written by Goebbels or something? You know, it's just nonsense. Extraordinary. People get so, can't watch that, can't show that, that shouldn't be allowed. And there was a huge complaint piece, which actually I was quite pleased about, in, what's that horrible right-wing, you'll have heard of them, Breitbart, sort of alt-right type newspaper, because I did a piece on Sky News about our film, and to be honest, I really managed to say a lot, because the presenter didn't know anything, you know, so other than throwing the usual stuff at me, well, it was a minority, well, it was a conspiracy, well, there was terror, you know, it was a bit feeble, really. So I managed to say a lot. So Breitbart News did this whole transcript of stuff I'd said, because to show up that the Sky News had failed to challenge me. In other words, you know, if you put a different view, obviously that's unacceptable and must be challenged. But that's what it's been like. Very positive face-to-face, and people very interested and serious, and some want to go away and read. And I hope the film, even though you kind of think it's got a short shelf life because of the centenary, and we made it because of the centenary, not because it suddenly mattered, whereas it never mattered before, but because, you know, there's a moment when people sort of silently wake up to a bit of history, which is always a really good thing. But I hope we do get to show it in sort of colleges and, you know, school students, A-levels and universities. At least we've had a showing in Berlin, which is really important.
All right.
We might have to go, but we could talk in the bar.
We could, that's right. I was going to ask you, Ceri, is there any book you could recommend which, you know, if you walk away now and you just want to read and just say you want to get a feel for exactly these debates which they were having at that time in 1918. Is there anything very, very useful?
Well, if you see, there's probably stuff in German that's I wouldn't know about, because English people are so lazy with languages, rubbish. And that's not true, that's not everyone, but certainly me and my generation. But the best book I've read in the last year was a guy called China Miéville. Brilliant, thoroughly researched. He spent sort of 5 years in the Russian archives just on the period from pre-February to the end of October. China Miéville, M-I-E-L-V-I-L-L-E, I think. I can't remember the title of the book, but there's only one. He's been all over the news, all over the place with his book. It's incredibly readable, and it goes in detail how things happened. And to be fair, 30 years ago and then last year, I reread Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution. But God, it's it's a slow haul, man, seriously. I'm not going to recommend it to you because it's just, you kind of go, it kills you off. Victor Serge is much more readable, seriously, and his book on the Civil War, or Year One of the Revolution, Victor Serge's stuff is a brilliant read because he's a great writer. John Reed's 10 Days That Shook the World isn't bad, but it's very journalistic. But this China Miéville book is great because he was a crime novelist, China, so he writes in a really, one of those ones you go on reading it through the night rather than I have to read this, which is great. But he's done it with all this original archive. The only weird thing about the book is that you think, did they ever do anything than spend time in meetings? Because he just goes through all these meetings and Lenin's pissed off and walks out and this goes on and, all the ins and outs in all these meetings and decisions that they had to take. And it's a constant battle, and they're meeting in hiding and, all sorts of stuff, things that are going on. And it's really fantastic. And then all the stories that you learn about that are all very well documented about the fact that which is slightly reworked in Eisenstein's October and in Battleship Potemkin. There's a few bits were used in the film under fair use and all that. But when the shot was due to be fired by the Aurora, that's the boat the ship you see at the end. This guy was supposed to stick a lantern up on the Winter Palace, and he's supposed to stick a lantern. That's the signal for the Aurora to fire, and he can't find a lantern to stick on, and he's then trying to find a stick that he can hold up, and this goes on for several hours, which is why the final kind of toppling of the old regime takes so long. It's already over, really. Everybody's left. Everybody's fled the Winter Palace anyway. But Miéville traces all these incidents and stories which really bring the whole thing to life. It's very real, And similarly, Victor Serge does it, and you realise how horrific the Civil War was. And I read a lot of stuff on the armies of intervention that I didn't know before. And the 4 million dying of famine, interesting, the American Red Cross have got an incredible archive of, just child mortality. And people are literally dying in their thousands. So you kind of understand, however, I like Alan Hudson's point about, thank God we didn't have to make those sorts of moral decisions, the horror of it. But what do you do when the kulaks, which are the richer peasants, are withholding grain? And people are just dying, and not in their thousands, but 4 million die of starvation. It's quite something to imagine that out of that you could have had some great new society. It's amazing they did what they did, really, I suppose. I think I should shut up.
All right, I think we need to leave the room anyway. I just want to say one thing, and this was organised by Freiblick. So if you're not on our mailing list, on our meetup page, you can come and see me, and we'll include you on if you want to be invited to any of our next discussions. We do sometimes have historical topics. We did a debate on the Luther on the 31st of October, the Luther's Reformation, which was very, very full. It was packed, so we can see the difference. It was maybe a bit more linked to, I don't know, whatever. So that was also very, very good. And yeah, so if you're interested, you can just come and see me and give me your email address. Next thing is, films are for sale. How much do they cost?
Yes, please. Yes, you really help us and get it, get it out there. Have a row over your Christmas dinner about the Russian Revolution. It's always a fun thing to do. They're €10, the film, and
then there's the other one. No, it's
well, there's
Sylvia
three.
Pankhurst.
We make a lot of programs every month, but our three major films that I brought are film on C.L.R. James, the famous anti-colonialist Trinidad-born, and also an internationalist, Sylvia Pankhurst, very famous suffragette, who was also part of the first international, all made with young volunteers, and all quite exciting and challenging, if you like that kind of thing.